Hi everyone, welcome to this video where we are going to discuss the concept of security attacks, the different categories of attacks, and how these attacks can be performed on an organization. As discussed in the earlier video, security attacks is one of the three important concepts which has been specified under OSI security architecture. Along with security attacks, we have security mechanisms and security services. To start with the definition of an attack, we have to understand that this attack is any kind of action that compromises the security of information owned by an organization. In other words, any action that has been performed which compromises an information system owned by an organization or by an individual can be termed as an attack. So an action which has got a false intent behind it. And these attacks actually jeopardize the system's security and aim to compromise the major security goals as discussed before. The security goals being the CIA triad, which is confidentiality, integrity, availability, and authenticity. As per the X.800 and RFC 2828, the security attacks are actually categorized into two types. The first type is something called as a passive attack, and the second category being the active attacks. So let's look at how these attacks are performed and what is the difference between these two categories. So let me start with the passive attacks first. So a passive attack attempts to learn or make use of the information from the system but does not affect the system resources. So what we are trying to understand here is the attacker will simply listen onto the communication. So whatever is happening, he will be monitoring or listening in onto the communication, but will not attempt to change or do any modifications or any alterations to the data. So the attacker might indulge in eavesdropping and monitoring the contents of a message. That is the reason we term this as a passive attack. So these attacks are termed as passive simply because the main goal of the attacker is just to gather the information but not make any alterations to the message or harm the system's resources. Because the attacker is not doing any modification, he is not altering anything, he is not stopping anything, he is not changing anything, his presence might not be actually known to the sender or the communicating parties. You can understand here, a passive attack is difficult to detect simply because no modification or tampering of data is performed and the user might not be aware of the presence of the attacker. Simply imagine a situation where you and your friend are talking inside a room and there might be a jealous third party sitting outside and eavesdropping on your communication, just putting an ear to the door, trying to find out what's happening inside, what you guys are talking. Do you expect him to be? No. So it is very difficult to detect simply because there is no modification done. He's not making any noise. He's not trying to join in on your communication. He's just sitting there and listening in on what's happening. Similarly, the passive attacks are very difficult to detect, but they can be prevented. Of course, they can be prevented. Of course, you can put a very big door in between so that whatever you are speaking might not go outside. Now, the passive attacks can be prevented. Technically speaking, prevention of passive attacks can be done by employing encryption techniques. So we'll discuss more about the encryption techniques later on in our videos. So by encryption techniques, what happens is whichever message you are sending, once it's encrypted, it gets into an unintelligible form so that only it can be read back after decryption. The decryption can only be done by your intended recipient. So to whomever you are sending the message, only he can decrypt the message and read it. All the other people sitting in between will not be able to read what the message is. Of course, they might be able to view what the message is, but they will not be able to understand anything out of it. The two types of passive attacks are release of message contents and traffic analysis. As I told you, the passive attack simply attempts to learn or make use of the information from the system, but does not affect the system resources. So that is the reason we call this as a passive attack. The first variant of the passive attack is something called as a release of message contents. What it does is it simply tells you that let us see the attacker sits in between the communicating parties and is more intent on capturing the information sent by the user and reading the sensitive information. The examples include reading an email or tapping into a phone conversation between the communicating parties. So, as per the security terminology and the textbook which I follow, William Stallings, imagine this communicating party's name is Bob, and the other end of the communicating party is Alice, and let him be the attacker, and his name is Darth. He's the bad guy here. So, the second variant is also called as traffic analysis. Here also, the attacker simply performs or simply monitors the ongoing communication between these two parties. And once he has collected enough information by doing this traffic analysis, he will be able to deduce the identity of the communicating parties, who is Bob, who is Alice, what they are talking, at what time they are talking, how much time they are talking. All those kind of things can be deduced by doing a traffic analysis. So what happens in these passive attacks is that if Bob sends a message to Alice, Darth, who is sitting on the network, somehow has access to this particular channel, and somehow these messages will be read by Darth. Darth does not do any modification to this message. He will be simply listening on or just reading all the messages that are sent between Bob and Alice. That is called as release of message contents. This message might contain sensitive information also, right? So here, without the knowledge of these two communicating parties, both Bob and Alice doesn't know that Darth is sitting in between, and Darth is able to read the messages that are being exchanged between these two parties, between them. So any sensitive information that Bob is sharing with Alice is now also visible to Darth. This is called as release of message contents. In other words, sensitive information is now visible to unauthorized third parties. Coming to traffic analysis, Darth, what he does here is he wants to identify what Bob is talking to Alice. So what he does, he simply, maybe he will monitor the entire traffic channel for maybe a day or a couple of days or even a week. So he will be in a position now to guess where Bob is communicating from, what is his IP address, who is Alice, what is her IP address, what time Bob starts the communication with Alice, what length of communication is happening, and also the type of communication as well, whether they are exchanging pictures, whether they are exchanging messages or anything else. This is called as traffic analysis. The main point here to observe is that though Darth is doing all this traffic analysis, he will be collecting huge amounts of information. He is not changing anything. He is not doing any modifications. He is not altering anything. He is not stopping anything. So both Bob and Alice will be unaware of the presence of Darth. They don't know that Darth is here, but Darth keeps on gathering information. That is called as traffic analysis. Based on these two things, the two types of passive attacks, we should be able to understand that the emphasis in dealing with passive attacks is on prevention rather than detection. They're very difficult to detect because you simply don't know that an attacker is present. So what we have to understand, or what we have to put more emphasis is to deal with passive attacks is to encrypt our messages. Now, once this message is encrypted, even though Darth can access this message, he will not be able to read any information out of it, because it's this message, if it is encrypted at Bob, that means you lock it with a key. Only the corresponding key to unlock it will be at Alice. So even though this message is read by Darth, he will not be able to get anything out of it. He will not be able to read what is inside. He might be able to view, but he might not be able to read it. This message can only be opened by Alice because she has the other key, okay, or the corresponding key. That is the reason we say that encryption can be performed to safeguard against passive attacks. Let's talk about the second category, which we call it as active attacks. By now, you must have understood here, passive attacks does not change any contents. So obviously, active attacks deals with modification of content. So an active attack attempts to alter the system resources or affect their operation. The main objective of such an attack is to interfere with network operations by either modifying the data stream or even introduce a false data stream. So unlike our passive attacks, active attacks, what it is involves is the attacker will be modifying the data and even create false data completely also. Which makes it very easy to detect, isn't it? So these attacks do involve modification of data and are hence easy to detect. Once you know that the data has been modified, if you have some doubt, you can easily identify that there has been an attack which was played on this data. So though easy to detect, compared to passive attacks, they are hard to prevent with many sophisticated threats, which include your physical threats, software threats, and network vulnerabilities present these days. Simply put, if all the people are good, then there are no active attacks. But you can't imagine that, isn't it? This is not a perfect world. So you cannot prevent an active attack. You will be able to detect it and maybe recover from it to ensure this does not happen in the next time, but you cannot completely prevent it. So once again, just like passive attacks, the active attacks are categorized into masquerading, modification of messages, replay attacks, and denial of service attacks. These are the 4 different categories of attacks which come under the active attacks. Let's understand what they are. First, let me start with masquerading attack. So masquerading attack, you can see here, what is happening is, in this attack, the entity, once again, let me use the same terminology. This is Bob, and this is Alice, and this is Darth. So Bob is the one who actually talks to Alice, or which actually communicates with Alice. Maybe Darth, after performing a traffic analysis, now knows what is the time that Bob usually communicates with Alice, and now sends a message to Alice, which Alice will think that this message originated from Bob. So are you getting it? Darth is pretending to be Bob and sending a message to Alice here. So masquerading is usually done by using stolen IDs and passwords, or by passing the authentication mechanisms using other forms of attacks. So this is called as masquerading attack, where one entity pretends to be a different entity. So one entity pretends to be a different entity with the motive of the attacker is to gain unauthorized privileges. Here, Darth actually sends a message pretending to be Bob to Alice. As I told you, these are easy to detect. Sir, but how do you detect it? Maybe Alice will think that this message which has been created by Darth is slightly different to Bob, and she can directly call Bob and ask, hey Bob, did you send this message? Obviously, Bob will say no. So in such a way, these attacks can be detected easily, because this is what we call as fabrication of messages. This attack is also called as fabrication. It means an attacker is actually creating a false data stream, pretending to be the original sender. This is called as masquerading attack. The second category of the active attack, called as message replay, which involves the passive capture of a genuine message sent by the sender and its subsequent retransmission to create an authorized effect. Now, once again, in our example, when Bob is sending a particular message to Alice, so let us assume that this is my message, Alice has received it. While at the same time, Darth has captured this message M and he stored it. Maybe after Bob has stopped communicating with Alice, he has sent the same message back to Alice to create some kind of undesired effect. So to put it into perspective, let us assume that you are communicating with the bank. You have sent your username password to authenticate yourself to your bank server so that you can get your details from the bank. If I am the attacker, what I would do is I will sit on the network. I have done a traffic analysis on your network stream, and I know that every day at morning 10 o'clock, you visit your bank website to check your information, to check your account information and other financial details. So what I do, I sit on the network at 10 o'clock, maybe perform some kind of attack on that, so that I will capture that particular packet which contains your login and password information that you shared with your bank, that you sent to the bank. Okay. Once your session is closed, maybe you will close the session after 1 minute or so, or maybe 30 seconds or 1 minute. As soon as you close the session, what I will do is I will resend that packet. I'm not going to change anything. I'm just going to replay that packet to the bank server. What the bank server thinks is it's you who is trying to log in for the second time, and the attacker can now have access to your bank account. So this is called as a message replay attack. We have to safeguard against such attacks also. So this attack involves passive capture of a genuine message sent by the sender at a point of time, and maybe resending this message at a later stage to get that undesired effect. Okay, so that the other entity, the other communicating entity, whether it might be a bank server or it might be Alice as well, will think that this message is the actual message which is being sent by the sender at that point of time. This is called as a message replay attack. Once again, a simple OTP or a simple callback will detect this kind of attack as well. The third category is something called as modification of messages. Here, what you do is, once again, the attacker who sits in between will capture the message that is sent by Bob, and he will modify this particular message. Now, let us say that in this message, Bob says that let's have a meeting at 6 p.m. and Dart doesn't want that to happen. So what he will do is he will change the message to such a way that once again he will maybe write it as 8 p.m. He doesn't want these two guys to meet. So he can do that modification also. So this attack involves making certain alterations to the captured messages or delaying or reordering of the message sequence to produce an unauthorized effect. In other ways, if you're trying to send to the bank, say that send maybe 1,000 to a particular your friend's account. And once the attacker has captured that message, he can add another 0 here, or even he can change the bank account number to his own personal number. So that's what modification is about. So modification involves capturing of a genuine message, changing its contents, and then sending it to the other entity. So this is called as modification of messages. This is an attack on your integrity. As I told you, integrity deals with the genuineness of the message, originality of the sender, trustworthiness of the sender, and the accuracy and consistency of the message, which is being lost here. Integrity tells you that the contents of a message must only be modified by the authorized individuals only. It might be Alice or it might be Bob who has the capability of changing that message, but not Darth, which is missing here. So this is called as modification of messages. And the last category, we call it as denial of service. This attack prevents or inhibits the normal functioning or management of communication facilities. These attacks can be targeted or generalized. In a way, see, if Darth doesn't want Bob to access a particular server where his information is stored, what he can do is he can do a denial of service attack. Maybe physically he can go plug off the wiring or cut off the wires or even switch off the power supply, or sitting on the internet he can just send random messages or too many messages to the server so that it gets inundated and completely gets down, breaks down. That is called as a denial of service attack. Its main intention is to ensure that Bob does not have access to the server. Imagine in the CIA triad, we spoke about availability, isn't it? So availability, denial of service attack, or this is also called as interruption. This is also called as interruption. Interruption is an attack on availability. This modification is an attack on integrity. Okay, so this is interruption. So what he's doing is, this is DoS attack. So here we are trying to prevent an authorized individual not getting access to the services which he is supposed to have access to. So that is called as an interruption attack or denial of service attack. A most recent one which you must have come across every day when you are using www web pages, when you are browsing, that you see CAPTCHA, isn't it? Right? This is to prevent systems against something called as a distributed denial of service attack, where it involves botnets and zombies. So that, and like CNC center, where one person can send thousands of messages to a server, so that it exceeds the capability of the server to respond, and it breaks down, so that nobody else is going to get service from that particular server, or nobody is going to get access to the server. So that is what we call as a DDoS attack. We will discuss more about the DDoS attack in our later videos. But as of now, coming back, this is the fourth category of your active attack. Once again, I can easily find out or detect what is the problem. And once I start troubleshooting, I will be able to identify that the server has been down because of an attack that is being done from the internet. An attacker can send such messages, can send a sequence of hundreds and thousands of messages to the server to overload its capability or to overload its capacity, so that it breaks down and it is no longer functioning. That is called as a denial of service attack. In other words, we call it as interruption. So interruption is the attack on availability. Modification is an attack on integrity. Okay. And this, we have come to the close of this attack video. So let me just summarize. In a passive attack, no modification of data occurs, and the target does not know about its occurrence unless they have a monitoring and an alert system. So as I told you, the release of message contents, we also call it as interception. In some books, the terminology is given as interception, which is a passive attack. And this interception is an attack on confidentiality. So confidentiality tells you that your messages or your information must be kept private. It should not be visible to a third party. But interception is where a third party is able to monitor everything. It is able to view whatever information you are sharing with your other communicating party. So in an active attack, the system resources and data are altered or otherwise damaged, affecting the system's normal operations. So this is the main difference between an active and passive attack. Passive attack, no modification of data, nothing is changed, no alterations done. It is very difficult. The user doesn't even know that an attacker is present. In an active attack, on the contrary, it involves modification of the messages, might be damaging the resources or alteration of the sequence of messages, so that it makes it easier to detect. Passive attacks, though difficult to detect, can be prevented by implementing certain security mechanisms. Active attacks, easy to detect but difficult to prevent, because day to day the sophistication of attacks that are performed by the cyber criminals is on the rise. So this is regarding the security attacks, the two categories attacks that we have. And good luck. Thank you very much.